The first time they saw the thing, they laughed, said it looked like a pile of dead branches leaned against a fence in a panic. One man joked it must have been built by her mule, not her hands. But come December, when the wind howled and the frost turned stronger men's cabins into coffins, that same pile of sticks was the only thing standing between her children and death. And by then, nobody was laughing. It wasn't just the weather. It never was, not out there. Wind could kill a man just as easy as thirst, and every settler knew it. But they still thought her windbreak was foolish, ugly, pointless, built too close, built too high, built too wrong. Everything they didn't understand, they mocked. And everything they mocked, they left alone, which was just the way Margaret Dalton needed it. Margaret had been a widow for 8 months when she started building the thing. She didn't cry when she buried Jacob. She didn't have time. He died like a candle goes out. Just gone one morning, jaw clenched and cold in the bed beside her. The children didn't wake until she'd wrapped him in canvas and dragged him into the frozen ground out back. She dug fast, using the pick and the short-handled spade because the earth was near rock beneath the snow. She didn't mark the grave with anything but a split piece of firewood. She had to save the rest for burning. The first windbreak went up 2 days after that. She didn't know what she was doing. Not really. But she remembered how her Jacob had cursed the wind every winter. Said it wasn't the cold that robbed you. It was the way the wind snuck through boards and took your warmth like a thief in the walls. Said he'd seen cabins with fires roaring, but the wind pushed so cruel it felt like sitting naked in snow. A man can trap heat, he'd say, but you can't trap wind. You gotta stop it before it gets close. That's what she built. Not a wall, not a structure, just a crooked, hunched-together fence made of willow limbs and pine boughs, driftwood and old tools, cracked chairs and broken doors, anything that could be dragged into a line and hammered into frozen dirt. She twisted hay ropes and weaved cloth into the gaps. She bent the shape like a horseshoe around the cabin's north side, where the wind came screaming down the ridge and snapped fence posts clean in the night. People called it strange. Some said it would catch fire and burn the cabin with it. Others said it would collapse in a storm and kill her children. A few just stared and said nothing, shaking their heads, but not one offered to help, not that she asked. She wasn't the kind to ask, never had been. There was no time anyway. The worst freeze hadn't hit yet, but Margaret felt it in her knees, in the way her joints locked early in the morning, in the way the clouds moved slower across the sky. The wind carried a kind of promise, not of snow, but of hunger. It carried the silence of birds already gone, and the scratch of tree limbs that hadn't moved in days. And it carried a warning she couldn't afford to ignore. So she kept building. The children didn't understand. Jessie was 6, Ruth barely 3. They watched from the porch wrapped in the old army blanket while their mother hammered a rusted saw blade into place at the corner post, tying it with bark twine like she was fixing a wagon wheel. Jessie had cried the night Jacob died, but not since. Ruth hadn't said a word, only clung to her brother like he was the last familiar thing in the world. They'd eat boiled root again that night, maybe a bit of salt pork if Margaret could trade a basket to the Lewises down the trail. But the Lewises weren't the neighborly type. Their own firewood had run short already, and the youngest of their 5 had been seen coughing blood behind the smokehouse 2 days past. No one wanted visitors, not in times like these, especially not a widow. She started sleeping in front of the door with the axe near her side, not because of wolves, though she'd heard them, but because she'd caught footprints out by the well. Men's boots, not her own. 1 set, maybe 2. They didn't come to the door, just stood out there a while, then vanished. She didn't say anything to the children, but she burned every spare rag sealing cracks under the floor and stacked a pile of stones by the hearth to throw if needed. A gun would have been better, but Jacob had pawned the rifle last spring, trying to get enough flour for planting. The trade failed. The seed had been moldy. He came home empty-handed and ashamed, and now he was in the ground behind the cabin. Margaret stared at the fire long each night, thinking of that rifle, of what she might have done different, of how she'd let him ride alone. But guilt was no use, not when the logs were shrinking and the meat was already gone from the smokehouse, and not when her children were coughing even while they slept. Every mistake was frozen into the walls now. The only thing left to do was keep them from dying. The windbreak got taller. She dragged a whole barn door across the trail one morning, dragging it through snow and breaking the ice crust with her knees. She leaned it into the curve of the wall and stuffed the corners with burlap. Then she added a ladder, broken in half and sunk into the dirt like a spine, then a full wagon axle stripped clean. It didn't matter if it made sense. It mattered that it stood. It mattered that it broke the wind before it reached the cabin. She learned to listen. Every night, the wind changed a little, came from a slightly different angle, so she'd get up before dawn and move parts of the wall. Some days it meant tearing a piece down. Other days it meant dragging a whole bench from the side shed and splitting it in half with a sledge. She was building a barrier, yes, but more than that, she was learning how to think like wind. And for the first time since Jacob died, she started to feel like she wasn't losing until Jesse coughed blood. It came sudden. One moment he was laughing, a thin, tired sound, watching her pull a frozen bedsheet into place over a new gap, and the next he was hunched over the chamber pot with red on his lips. Margaret didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She wrapped him in every blanket and cloth she could find and set him by the fire with hot stones near his ribs. She gave him broth, even though it meant using up what was left of the dried beef. She stayed up all night, listening to his lungs rattle and his breath fade in and out like a flickering candle. By morning, he was quiet, not dead, just quiet. She held him, wrapped around him like the windbreak wrapped around the cabin. Tight, ugly, awkward, imperfect, but unyielding. That day she didn't work on the wall. That day she sat beside the fire, arms around both children, feeding it with anything that would burn. Old boots, broken crates, the last leg of the stool. The smoke turned bitter, but she didn't care. She stared into the flames like they owed her something, like she could demand warmth the way men demanded obedience from their wives. She wasn't going to beg, she was going to take it. The wind screamed harder that night, but it didn't get in, not that time. And that was the first moment she believed her ugly windbreak might do something more than delay the inevitable. It might actually save them. But it wasn't finished, and the worst wind hadn't come yet. The silence, after Jesse's coughing fit, stretched on, longer than any scream. It was the kind of silence that wrapped around a mother's bones and whispered what no voice dared say aloud, that it wasn't over, that something worse was coming. The windbreak had held, but the sickness had gotten in, and Margaret knew, deep in her marrow, that it was now a race between the frost and her son's lungs. She didn't have medicine. She didn't have a preacher or a neighbor she trusted to help. All she had was a sagging cabin, a pile of burned-out furniture, and that crooked line of junk she'd shoved into the earth like a dying prayer. She couldn't afford to sit still again. Jesse's fever rose slow, like fire from damp logs, catching without showing flame. By morning, his eyes were half open, unfocused, and his lips cracked from thirst. Margaret soaked rags in melted snow and let Ruth press them to her brother's forehead. Ruth still hadn't spoken a word, but her small hands moved with a tenderness that tore through Margaret worse than any storm. She knew children didn't understand the full meaning of death, but they understood when something was wrong. Ruth didn't cry. She just watched her brother's chest rise and fall and glanced at the fire with eyes far too knowing for a 3-year-old. Margaret knew what was left in the root cellar. 3 potatoes, soft to the touch, half a jar of pickled cabbage, 1 old smoked trout, more bone than flesh. She counted it like bullets in a gun. It wouldn't last a week, not with Jesse needing hot broth, not with Ruth watching his face like she might lose the last piece of her old life. And the worst freeze was still to come. The windbreak was holding, but inside everything was breaking down. So she made the decision. It wasn't brave and it wasn't reckless. It was cold and mathematical, like cutting a rope that's too short to pull 2 children up the same cliff. She would walk to the river trail and trap something. Squirrel, rabbit, anything. If she couldn't trap, she'd steal. If she couldn't steal, she'd beg. And if that failed, she'd offer the last thing she had, herself. She didn't tell the children she was leaving. She just bundled Jessie tighter, kissed Ruth on the crown of her head, and said she'd be back before the shadows moved too far across the floor. She said it like a promise, but in her gut, she knew better. The air outside bit with a different kind of sharpness that morning. Not just cold, but alive, like the sky itself had turned against man. The trees groaned with frost and shed thin flakes of bark in the wind. The snow wasn't falling anymore. It hovered, suspended in the air like the breath of ghosts, drifting sideways more than down. The windbreak stood tall, but it rattled at the edges, and Margaret knew it wouldn't last forever without reinforcements. She followed the trail, down past the ridge, keeping to the animal paths where snow had packed shallow. Her boots were wrapped in burlap for silence, though they soaked through fast. She carried her father's trapline hook and a single snare made from braided fence wire. She didn't dare go further than the creek, but she knew the land well. If there was game to be had, it would be there. But she wasn't the only one hungry. Tracks in the snow told a story she didn't like. Deer, yes, but old ones, half filled in by recent drifts. No fresh prints. What she did find was smaller, rounder. Fox, or maybe something worse. Scavengers moved when the big game ran or died. And if they were moving now, it meant desperation had set in for all living things. She reached the creek by mid-morning, heart thumping faster from the cold than the walk. The water had frozen over entirely. A smooth, glassy ribbon of ice under powdered snow, the kind that snapped ankles if stepped on wrong. She placed her snare by a thicket of bare berry bushes and crouched behind a rock, watching, waiting, fingers numb. joints stiff, breath shallow. She waited 3 hours, not a single stir of life. When she stood, she could barely feel her legs. She yanked the snare free and turned back, cutting through the thicker woods for warmth. That's when she heard the voices. Two men, close. They weren't speaking loud, but the tone cut clear, sharp through the trees. Not friendly, not neighbors, and not just passing through. She dropped low behind a tree stump, heart pounding hard now for a different reason. She crept up just enough to peek through the pine boughs. They were at the Lewis place. One of them leaned against the woodpile like he owned it. The other kicked at the snow near the porch, holding something long. A rifle, maybe, or a walking stick too thick to be just that. Margaret squinted, trying to see more. Their coats were patchwork, not local. Boots mismatched. One had a hat too fine for a drifter, the kind you stole off a body, not one you earned. Outlaws. She didn't wait to see more. She turned and moved fast through the trees, not running, just moving with the kind of speed that made no noise but devoured distance. She'd seen men like that before, after the war, during the famine years, men who took what they wanted from women with no men to defend them. She'd heard stories of cabins burned, of widows left crawling through ashes with broken teeth and frozen hands. She wouldn't be one of them. By the time she reached the ridge again, the sun had shifted behind the clouds, casting long blue shadows over the snow. Her cabin came into view, small, sagging, smoke barely curling from the pipe, and behind it the windbreak stood like a siege wall from some ancient war. From above, she could finally see its full shape, twisted, uneven, but solid, and somehow beautiful. Her breath caught, not from the cold, but from the sight of it. It looked like a fortress, but it wouldn't matter if they came with fire. She hit the door and dragged the latch closed, bolting it with a spare beam from the floorboards. Jessie hadn't moved. Ruth looked up at her, wide-eyed, clutching the old rag doll she'd named Mr. Pine. Margaret didn't speak. She moved quickly through the room, dragging the washtub in front of the door, jamming firewood behind it. She smashed the last crate and split it into boards, stacking them by the window for reinforcement. Then she checked the axe, still sharp, still hers. She didn't light more firewood. Smoke might draw attention. Instead, she wrapped the children in every blanket, quilt, and coat she could find, then lined the walls with spare cloth and even old books, anything to hold the heat. She placed the last hot stone near Jesse's chest and kissed his forehead. Then she waited, not for the storm this time, for something worse. Outside, the wind screamed like a woman being murdered. The windbreak howled, but it didn't fall. Shadows shifted beyond the trees. Margaret stood by the window, axe in hand, breath shallow, and then there it was, a boot print, right at the edge of the trail, followed by another and another, heading straight for the cabin. She didn't shake. She didn't cry. She simply backed into the shadows and let the wind drown out everything but her heartbeat. If they came, she'd make sure they never left. The windbreak was ugly, crooked, strange, but it was hers, and so was the fight to keep what was behind it. The first knock came just after dusk, not hard, not loud but deliberate. Not a neighbor's knock, not the clumsy thump of a friend with frozen hands. It was slow, patient, meant to be heard but not answered. Margaret didn't move. She stood by the hearth, axe gripped low in her palm, the fire barely more than coals to avoid smoke. Jesse stirred in his blankets, wheezing like wind through a crack in a wall. Ruth pressed into her mother's leg, silent still. The knock came again, then silence. No voices, no footsteps, just the wind brushing snow off the roof like skeletal fingers raking the shingles. Margaret didn't step forward. She stayed in shadow, heart still, breath tight. Whoever it was knew she was inside. They weren't knocking to visit. They were knocking to see how long she'd pretend no one was home. She didn't answer. After a long moment, the boards on the porch creaked, a shift in weight. Then the steps again, not away but to the side, toward the window. She could almost feel the eyes peering in, searching for movement, for weakness. The cloth nailed across the glass fluttered just enough to cast a faint shape, and Margaret ducked lower. She slid the axe toward the wall and picked up the stove poker instead. Long blackened iron, still warm from the embers. If they forced the door, it wouldn't be fire she'd use first. It would be silence and steel. But the figure didn't try the door, didn't even speak. After a pause, the steps retreated, then nothing. For hours, she sat in silence, every muscle tense. The windbreak groaned under a new gust, and snow began again. Not thick, not fast, but constant. A fine powder that built slowly, erasing prints, swallowing shapes. It wasn't until the moonlight began breaking through the clouds that she risked moving. She peered through the side of the window cloth, just enough to see. Nothing. No man, no boot prints. Just a wind-smoothed crust over the trail, already hardening under the cold. Still, She didn't trust it. She dragged a second beam across the door and tied it to the first with rope. She jammed the broken stool legs into the corner cracks and spread ash across the porch floor. Any step would leave a mark. Then she poured what little lamp oil she had along the inside sill of the window and laid a matchstick nearby. If they broke through, she'd blind them with fire before anything else. And then the wind changed. It came down from the higher ridgeline, a rare direction, and hit the windbreak with such force that the entire cabin shuddered. The sound was like 1,000 voices screaming through pipes. The break held, but barely. Margaret ran outside, throwing her coat over her thin frame, boots crunching the crusted snow. Her hands were bare. She didn't feel them. She reached the windbreak just as a top beam began to sway loose. She caught it, barely. The weight nearly pulled her sideways, but she braced, shoved her shoulder under the frame, and wedged it back into place. She used an old rusted hammer, the head tied on with baling wire, and drove a frozen wedge through a split log at the base. The wall groaned like an animal, but it didn't fall. Behind her, the cabin light flickered in the window. Ruth's small face peered through a crack, then vanished. Margaret didn't go back inside yet. She circled the windbreak, checking for weak points. A piece of the old wagon axle had shifted. She reset it. A chair had fallen from its post and sunk halfway into the snow. She left it. No time. But then she found something else, a boot print, not hers, behind the leeward side of the windbreak, just near the edge of the south end, a single, deep print made by someone watching, someone close enough to see the cabin, but not close enough to be heard. She bent over it, heart in her throat. It hadn't snowed enough to cover it yet. That meant it had been made in the last hour. Someone had been there, while she was inside, maybe while she was feeding Jessie broth, maybe while Ruth had sat by the door humming that tuneless little song she made up after Jacob died, the song she never sang around anyone else. That's when Margaret felt it, the exposure, the rawness of her position, not just against the weather, but against them. There were people out there who had seen her family alone, had watched, had counted days, had measured her weakness like wolves circling an animal in a trap. She could almost hear their breathing, even though they were long gone. She moved faster than she thought she could. Back into the cabin, bolt the door, reinforce the hearth. Jessie stirred in his sleep, whispering words that didn't make sense. Ruth climbed into the bedroll with him and fell asleep without a word. Margaret didn't sleep, not that night. She fed the fire with what little was left. She stood by the door with the poker in her hands, breathing slow and even, listening to the wind scream and the walls creak and the snow build higher. And when dawn came, pale, grey, joyless, she didn't feel relief. She felt confirmation. They were being watched, and it was only a matter of time. The next day, she built the second windbreak, not as tall, not as wide, but just as crooked. This one wrapped the east side, not to block the wind, but to block the view, to make it harder for anyone standing in the trees to see the cabin windows. She used brush, chopped limbs, anything that would hold together. She burned her own bedding for rope. She tore up the last rug. She worked with the fury of a woman who'd run out of better options. A storm rolled in from the north that evening. Not a whiteout, not yet, but the kind that made the trees sway like they were dancing to death. She fed the stove with scrap she'd hidden beneath the floor, an old chest Jacob had made, a table leg, even her wedding trunk. When the fire caught, she didn't flinch. She just stared into it. Jessie worsened. That night, his fever climbed. His breath came with gasps. Margaret placed stones by the fire and wrapped them in cloth to line his bedding. Ruth placed one hand on his chest and hummed again. Margaret didn't stop her. It seemed to soothe him more than the broth or the steam. She couldn't stop the sickness, but she could stop them. That night she set snares, not for rabbits, for men. She rigged bells on the porch using wire and tin plates. She set a hatchet blade in the doorframe angled down. She laid ash trails outside the back and front entrances. She poured a shallow pan of water beneath the window so any step there would crack the ice, and then she slept. Not in her bed, not near the children, but standing, back to the wall, axe in hand, 1 foot forward like she was ready to swing. Because she was. They came again 2 nights later, but this time, not with a knock. This time, they tried the latch, the scratch of a gloved hand. The metal creaked, then silence. No voices, no whispered threats, just pressure. Gentle, testing, persistent. The rope held. The beam stayed firm. Margaret didn't speak. She pressed her back harder to the wall, jaw clenched, heart steady. The latch twitched, then footsteps in the snow, soft, muffled, a low whisper. "Ain't worth it, not tonight." Then they were gone. She waited till dawn to open the door. The ash was disturbed. The plates had shifted, but they hadn't forced entry, not yet. She found the print again, same place behind the windbreak. This time, 2 sets, one smaller than the other. She stared at them until her eyes watered from from the cold. Then she began gathering rocks. By the time the sun rose on the 12th day since Jessie first coughed blood, Margaret had already ringed the cabin with traps. Not the kind meant to catch fur, but the kind meant to catch legs. Deep pits hastily dug with the flat edge of a rusted spade, camouflaged with pine needles and frozen moss. She sharpened sticks and planted them inside, points angled upward. She left them shallow, half filled with snow. One wrong step would tear flesh and spill it across the ice. She hated doing it, hated what it meant, but she hated the thought of what might happen to Ruth more. This was no longer just about the cold, it was about invasion. The windbreak had become more than a structure. It was a perimeter now, a crude wall in a war nobody had announced, but one that had begun all the same. Each plank, each bone-dry branch hammered into the frost was a warning. You may survive the storm, but you'll bleed trying to reach what's mine. Jessie's fever had crested and broken sometime during the night. He was pale and thin, lips grey at the corners, but the wheeze had faded to a shallow breath. Margaret had felt his forehead and wept. Silent, motionless tears she wiped away before the children saw. She fed him warm broth made from boiled roots and the last scrap of pork skin. Ruth smiled for the first time in days and pressed her face to Jessie's shoulder, like it might keep him anchored to the world. Margaret didn't speak much anymore. Her voice had dried out like a river in drought. What she had left she gave to prayer, not the soft, hopeful kind muttered in warm pews, but the hoarse, half-spoken kind muttered through cracked lips into the wind. Let me hold them one more night. Let me feed them one more time. Let me bury them if I must, but let it be with dignity. Let it be with love. Then she'd press her hands to the frozen doorframe and breathe until the tears dried. The real storm came on the 14th night. It began as a growl, wind rumbling low across the ridgeline like an animal warning the dark. The trees bent in silhouette, groaning beneath the first icy gusts. Snow fell sideways, then upward, then in spirals. The cabin walls trembled. The chimney moaned like a throat full of dying breath. Margaret stood by the window, watching the windbreak sway like a ship mast under siege. The joints she'd reinforced last week now twisted, pulling away from the cords and bindings. She had only one choice. She ran out into it. Snow sliced her face like thrown sand. Her coat tore on a nail. The air felt thinner than ice, not cold, but absent, as though the storm had sucked all the warmth out of the world and replaced it with pressure. She clawed her way through knee-deep snow to the far post, the one that leaned hardest into the wind. A plank snapped free and whipped past her face. Another broke and flew toward the trees. She caught the third before it went, hammered it back down with the frozen heel of her hand. Then she screamed, not from pain, from effort, from rage, from the sheer stubborn refusal to watch her work die in front of her. Her voice vanished in the gale, swallowed whole by nature's fury. She pressed her shoulder to the post, driving the beam deeper into the ground with the weight of her body, her breath shallow, blood running from a scrape on her lip. The wall held, but she collapsed. For a moment everything went silent inside her skull. No wind, no breath, no fear, just cold, deep, pure, blue-black cold. She thought she saw Jacob there, in the snow, not dead, not warm, just watching. His eyes weren't accusing, they were proud. He said nothing. He only nodded once. When she opened her eyes again, the storm was still screaming, but she could move. She crawled back toward the cabin on hands and knees, dragging her right leg stiffly behind her. The skin beneath her boot was numb. The frost had kissed her hard. She reached the door and collapsed inside, slamming it behind her and dragging the last crate in front. The children were huddled together, shivering beneath the quilts. She didn't speak. She just stoked the fire and lit the last candle and waited. The storm howled like a world ending, and still, the windbreak held. They came again after the storm passed, not at night, in the grey of dawn. 3 shadows down the trail, walking slow, confident, men not afraid of being seen. 2 of them wore patched coats. The third had a red scarf wrapped across his face. They stopped where the fence used to stand before Jacob tore it down for firewood the winter before. Margaret saw them through a crack in the window cloth. One of them raised a hand, not in greeting, just to show he wasn't carrying a rifle. The message was clear. We don't need one. Margaret didn't move. They waited. A minute passed. Then 2, the tallest one, stepped forward. He called out, voice thin through the cold. "Ma'am, we know you're in there." Silence. He tried again. "Ain't looking to cause trouble. Just need a place to warm up." Still silence. "You got children? We seen the toys out back. "We won't stay long. Just a roof, miss, that's all." The wind shifted, carried his breath sideways. Margaret could smell it through the walls. She stood slowly, placed the axe by the door, picked up a lit coal from the stove with the iron tongs, carried it to the shallow basin of lamp oil beneath the window. Her hands didn't shake. Outside, the men muttered. Then the second voice, rougher with a sneer. "She's alone. We take it now, it's ours." The third man didn't speak, just stepped off the trail, right into the ash. Margaret heard the crunch of the crusted snow, but also the shift, the crack. The scream came fast, then the thud. He'd fallen into one of the pits, not deep enough to kill, but enough to maim. The other two lunged forward, cursing. Margaret lit the match, tossed it into the oil. Flames burst up the windowsill, licking across the glass with a roar. The inside of the cabin lit gold. Jessie stirred. Ruth screamed, but the fire was on the outside. The men scattered. One dragged the third from the pit, blood on his leg. The others looked back only once before vanishing into the trees. She knew they might return, knew they wouldn't forget, but they wouldn't come unprepared again, and that gave her time. Time to survive, time to bury the pain and keep breathing. 2 days passed. Then 3, no return. The storm had broken something, not just in the trees, but in the land. The wind quieted, the snow stopped falling, the sky turned from grey to white to blue, and for the first time in a month, the sun cut through the chill. Jessie sat up on his own. Ruth laughed. Margaret boiled a soup made from pine bark, water and hope. The windbreak stood tall behind them, crooked, ugly, imperfect, but whole. It had held, and so had she. The thaw came slow that year, slower than anyone remembered. The rivers stayed frozen into March, and the trails remained treacherous weeks after the first green shoots pushed up through the drifts. But to Margaret Dalton, the changing air wasn't marked by buds or birdsong. It was marked by breath, her son's breath, steady and soft, her daughter's laugh, faint but real, her own breath, no longer tight in her chest. It came in full now. It filled the cabin again, and for the first time in what felt like a century, it didn't freeze in the air. The wind had changed, not just the wind outside, the howling force that had clawed at the boards for weeks, like a beast trying to get in, but something deeper, something inside her, the part that used to believe in waiting for help, for mercy, for men. That part had died with Jacob, and what rose from its grave wasn't a grieving widow. It was something harder, something sharper. She stood outside the cabin one morning, boots still wrapped in cracked burlap, hands blistered from the axe, her breath fogged in the air, but it no longer scared her. The windbreak stood before her, sagging in places now, bent under its own weight. Some of the branches had come loose, a few beams had tilted, the ropes frayed. It looked like a thing long abandoned, but it had stood. She ran her hand along one of the planks, an old bed frame lashed to a door, braced with the axle from Jacob's broken wagon. It groaned under her touch, like it remembered the storm too. She almost smiled. Behind her, Ruth sat in the doorway carving something with a nail on a piece of soft wood. Jessie was inside, propped up in bed, sipping broth from a cup with both hands. His cheeks were still pale, but the hollows had begun to fill. His eyes followed the light again. When he smiled, it was small, but it was his. Margaret had sat beside him the night before and watched his chest rise and fall for hours, not out of fear, but out of wonder. The boy had lived. They all had. She had done what they said couldn't be done. No, she had done what they didn't even think to say, because no one had cared enough to warn her. No one had checked in after Jacob died. No one had offered a hammer or a handful of nails. They had just watched and waited to see if the widow would last. She had, and her children were alive because of it. The first visitor arrived in April. Margaret didn't hear him at first. The snow had receded to a crusted edge at the forest line, and her ears had grown too used to silence. But the knock on the frame was hesitant, not like the ones during the dark nights. This one carried no threat, just uncertainty. She opened the door with the axe in her hand anyway. It was Mr. Purdle from down the ridge, a man she'd spoken to maybe 5 times in her life. His face was windburned and his beard carried bits of ice. Even now, his hat was off, held in both hands. He didn't look her in the eye. "Ma'am," he said, "wasn't sure if any of you were still here." Margaret didn't answer right away. She stepped aside, just enough for him to see Ruth playing with sticks in the yard. Jessie was behind her, standing now, leaning against the doorframe with the quilt wrapped around his shoulders like a shawl. Purdle stared. "I'll be damned," he said softly. "You might be," Margaret said, not smiling. He coughed into his hand. We lost 8 cabins. Lewis's moved south, Coleman's too. Others froze in place." He glanced at her wall, the crooked, sagging windbreak. They said you'd never make it out here alone. She said nothing. He shifted again. Some folks are trying to get a supply train through from Red River. Might be a week. If you need anything. Margaret raised an eyebrow. What makes you think I need anything now? Purdle looked at the wall again, then at the children, then at her. He didn't answer. He left soon after. Margaret shut the door behind him and braced it again, not because she feared him, but because habit was a harder thing to kill than winter. The supplies did come, not in a wagon train, but by mule and sled, led by a preacher and 2 teenage boys from town. They carried dried beans, flour, a bolt of cotton, and a single tin of peppermint candy wrapped in cloth. Margaret took what she needed and left the rest, telling them to take it to the Dawson girl who'd lost her mother 3 cabins down. The boys stared at her like she was a ghost. The preacher asked if she wanted a blessing. She said she already had one. The wind hadn't taken her children. That was enough. Spring bloomed late, but it came. The stream behind the cabin cracked and flowed, and Margaret hauled buckets of clean water up the trail each day while Jessie picked bark for kindling. Ruth began humming again. Full songs this time, not just fragments. Margaret started keeping a tally on the wall. 1 notch for each day they'd survived past the cold. After 30, she stopped. The point had been made. The windbreak began to fall in places, not from failure, from rest, from release, as though the wall itself knew its job was finished. Margaret let it fall. She didn't rebuild it. She didn't need to. The neighbors began talking, quietly at first, but then more boldly. They called it a miracle. They said she must have had help, must have known something, must have found shelter somewhere secret. Some said she was lucky. Others whispered words like witch and hermit, but no one could explain it. How a widow with 2 small children had outlasted one of the worst freezes in memory without starving, freezing, or going mad. None of them asked her directly. None of them knew about the traps, or the fire at the window, or the blood in the snow that had never been hers. By June, the forest bloomed again. Margaret planted beans with Jessie's help. Ruth learned to split kindling without nicking her fingers. The cabin leaned, but it still stood. And one evening, when the sun hung low and gold over the treetops, Margaret walked out to where the windbreak had once formed its crooked arc and stood in the hollow it had left behind. She looked out over the trees. The wind came gently that night, not a scream, but a whisper. It brushed her cheek like a hand that no longer meant harm. She closed her eyes and let it pass. Behind her, Jessie called out that supper was ready. Ruth's laughter followed, high and clear. Margaret opened her eyes, turned, walked back inside. That windbreak, they'd say later, was the ugliest thing they ever saw. Not built to last, not built proper. A pile of junk stacked by someone who didn't know what she was doing. But they were wrong. It wasn't ugly. It was honest. It was built from desperation, stitched together with grief and frozen by nights no one else endured. It was shaped by wind and held together by love. It was imperfect, lopsided, foolish by every man's standard. But it did what no other wall could. It kept them alive, and no one could ever take that away. Not the storm, not the cold, not the men who watched from the trees. It wasn't the wall that mattered. It was the woman behind it, and she had already survived more than they ever would.